You know, the more of these videos that I put together, the more I start to think to myself, I probably should have named the series Things I Know I Should Do, but didn't because I'm an idiot. Too long? Hello, my name is Michelle and this is What Not to Do. So, I finished my first draft of my novel and I have been poring over the pages, editing, rewriting, and changing like crazy, ready to rip my hair out because of the mistakes that I've made. And that's what this series is about. It's about talking about my mistakes so that hopefully you don't make these. And this week, I am talking about the heart and soul of your novel, your characters, the thing that keeps people coming back reading, the thing that drives your story forward, the thing that really invests your readers into your novel. And I didn't spend quite enough time developing my characters, and I didn't spend the right kind of time developing my characters. And that's what this video is about. Intent. Now this may seem like an odd one to be the first thing on the list, but really it is the most vital aspect of designing a character, because you need to know what your intent is for that character. Is this character going to be your main character? Is it going to be your villain? Is it going to be your main character's best friend's sister's dog? Because each of those has a different amount of detail that you really need to put into developing that. I know that's a bit of a dramatization to talk about the dog and compare it to a main character or a villain, but you get my point. You don't want to spend pages upon pages writing down detailed backstory, attributes, personality traits, fears, wants, goals for a character that has 2 lines in your entire book. Start broad. One of my biggest mistakes when I was designing and planning my characters is that I started off hyper specific, lots of little intricate details, and I ended up getting bored and skipping on a lot of the important things that I should have put into it because I just felt so bogged down and I felt like, oh my God, I don't want to do this anymore. Someone save me. So what you need to do is start broad. Think of an aspect or something about the character that you want to portray, something about that character that is important to you as the writer, and focus on that as kind of a starting point for developing your character. So in my world building video, I talked about the example of a country plagued by disease. And let's say I have a character who's from that country, okay? I've already done my world building. I know I'm going to have a country that's plagued by disease, and I want this character to be from there, okay? At that point, I have to decide how is that going to impact him and his personality and his life and his livelihood and his traits. So let's think about that for a moment. He's from this country. Maybe he lost people. Maybe family or friends died. Or maybe he was one of those rich people that was isolated from the rest of his country. So while the lessers were dying off and his country was perishing, he was secluded and isolated and kept safe. Maybe he has guilt about that or shame. The point of starting broad is so that you think of your character as a person, not just a list of traits. You want to be able to visualize the person so that when you're writing your character later on, it comes more naturally and fluidly as to how they would react, respond, interact to different scenarios and events that your plot is going to put them into. Goals, or the driving force behind your character's personality. Now this isn't the plot of your book, but this is more to tell you how your character is going to respond to different events that your plot creates. And thinking about your character's goals, their ambitions, their motivations, their fears, it will help better build and develop your character for you. So that when you get into some of the more specifics, you kind of can almost picture it. It'll feel cleaner to you. You'll be thinking to yourself, oh, okay, I can do this. So using the example that I gave before about the plagued country, let's say this wealthy man was a prince. And now that the plague has ended, he feels guilt and shame for himself being secluded and isolated. Maybe his goal is going to be to prove to himself and to the people from his country that his life was worth keeping around, that there was some meaning behind him being isolated while all of these other people died. And that could help propel him forward and explain why some wealthy prince noble character is going to leave his life of luxury and go off on some grand adventure to go save a kingdom or rescue a damsel or fight a dragon or whatever the plot is. Well-rounded. Now this is where you're going to start to think about that list a little bit. You're not going to start answering all of your questions, but you kind of need to start to plan for that stage. Because what you need to do is make sure you're building a well-rounded character. You want a character who has positive traits and negative traits. They can be physical, emotional, mental, however you want to design it, but a good, well-rounded character is not just one thing. Are you designing a sexed-up villain who's going to manipulate her way into the protagonist's life and then ultimately betray him in this big grand finale? Well, she needs to have more than "I'm hot" as her descriptor. You need to think about what kinds of experiences your character would have in their life based off of the previous things we've talked about. These kinds of things are going to impact them, their education, their skill set, their hobbies, their interests. It's going to be impacted by what they would have access to or what would have been thrust upon them in the course of their lives. And thinking about these kinds of things will help you better create a more well-balanced character instead of a flat, one-dimensional one. So with my example of the prince, he's probably highly educated, impeccably dressed, perfectly groomed. You know, he may play an instrument, he may dance, he may know a little bit of combat skill, but mostly for flourish to impress the ladies. Nothing so much as combat experience. And so if you think about these kinds of things, and then you say, well, okay, that's what his life was like then. But now that he's going to be leaving home and he's going to be setting off on an adventure alone, things are going to change. He's going to be impacted differently because he's not going to have his servants around to tend to his every need. He's not going to have chefs, and he's not going to have maids, and he's not going to have seamstresses at his beck and call. He's going to have problems. He may end up being swindled because he's naive to the ways of the world. He may end up mugged because he doesn't know what kinds of things to look for when you're wandering through a tavern or walking down a random back alley. I'm not saying these particular things have to happen to him, but it is important to think about those because when you think about those, you start to add more depth to your character. And he starts to become more of a person in your mind. Because let's be honest, people love flaws. They love problems. They love struggle. They love seeing people overcome their struggles. It gives you hope in your personal life when you're thinking about all the crap you've got to deal with on the day-to-day. And that's what makes a character more believable. It makes a character more realistic. Get specific. It's time. It's time, guys. We've been building up to this. Now it's time for you to pull out your pen and paper, your notepad, your computer, whatever it is that you use for writing down those details. Get out your list and start writing things down. Think about appearances, habits, mannerisms. Think about things like, what are their likes? What are their dislikes? What kind of education do they have? What makes them happy? What makes them sad? What is their voice like? What is their sense of humor like? Use the foundations that you've already established for yourself to start building out those details. So back to my example of the prince. You're probably already starting to picture in your mind what a prince would look like. And part of that is going to have to do with the country he's from. What is the environment, the temperature, what kind of plants or animals or hardships does that country have? Because that's going to probably impact the way he dresses, the way he talks. You know, you're going to have different kinds of societies and different kinds of reactions based off of those societies. So in this case, maybe he had a bit of arrogance to him, talked down to the staff, treated commoners as if they were nothing. And then half of his country was wiped out by plague. And suddenly he's looking at himself in the mirror and hating the person he was and wants to make a change. Well, that kind of change is going to impact more about him than just his actions. His personality is going to change, sure. But so is his appearance. If he goes off on an adventure and he can't shave because he doesn't know how, he might grow out a beard. He might try to give himself a haircut and chop his hair all nasty. He might tear his clothes while he's out adventuring and not know how to stitch them up. So he just kind of halfway does a thing that might be a stitch patchwork, who knows, you know? Or he might decide, screw it, and just, you know, buy new clothes and end up running out of money because he was too frivolous with the money he had because he's never had a concept of money before. You start writing down the details and thinking about, this is the character now. Now I see him as a character. I can now write down the specifics. I can think about his education level. I can think about what his training would be like. I can think about what kinds of things he would have access to, you know, what kinds of things he wouldn't know. And you can start better planning them. And that's the important part about designing your character. And once you start thinking about your character as a full-fledged person and not just a statistical sheet, a list full of different traits, it'll make it a lot easier for you to write dialogue and actions, reactions to the various events that you're planning in your plot. But you also need to keep in mind that humans are contradictions. Oftentimes, we slip into old ways or make poor choices. And even if you have the best intentions, that doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily do the right thing. So, with the prince example, what happens if somebody tries to mug him and he defends himself and ends up killing the person? Yeah, it was self-defense, but he's never killed anyone before. And he starts to feel guilt about that. How would this prince-like character handle that? Well, one way would be to ignore the whole thing entirely. Another thing would be to grieve. But is he really going to grieve over someone he doesn't really know? Maybe feel guilty, maybe, you know, be mournful about it for a short period, but he's not really going to be seriously impacted in that way. Or maybe he does something completely unexpected and really stupid. He finds that person's family and he goes up to them and hands them a bag of coin. Because to him, people's lives are worth coin. That's all he's ever known. People have value. And maybe that blows up in his face when the grieving family beat the shit out of him because they're sitting here thinking, excuse me? You killed my brother and you're trying to pay me off with your 3 measly coins? What the hell is wrong with you? You know, my point is that good guys aren't always good. Bad guys aren't always bad. That's the whole purpose of building well-rounded characters. They all have flaws. They all have strengths. They all have weaknesses. They have traits that make them appealing, traits that make them unappealing. And it's important for you to keep that kind of thing in mind. Because if you don't and you build a perfect character or one that is just absolutely horrible with absolutely nothing about them that would be at all appealing. I'm not saying they have to be likable. I'm not saying they have to be lovable, but they have to be multidimensional. Otherwise, they're going to fall flat. And your readers are going to see that. They're going to read that character's actions and be like, so this bad guy's bad because reasons? Yeah, okay, sure. And so just keep that in mind when you're developing your characters. Now, one last final thing, just kind of a word of caution when developing a character, especially if it is a villain type character, is just because they're bad doesn't mean they have to have a tragic backstory. That is a very common trait that people like to do, but if you really look at the people around you in your real life who are assholes or dicks or someone that you might be like, yeah, screw that guy, most of the time they don't have tragic backstories. They've probably been completely entitled. If I were to take this Prince character and turn him into the villain, then his people dying, he could have not cared. You know, that doesn't matter to him. They died. His care could be, okay, well, now that that all these people are dead, where's my workforce? Okay, we need to bring in some slaves, or we need to bring in some, I don't know, new workers, or we need to attack that country over there and, you know, get their people, or we need to do whatever we need to do so that I can keep having the things I'm used to in my life because, you know, I'm a prince. You know, so think about those kinds of things and don't get too bogged down in some specific kinds of tropes because it gets kind of boring. That's it. Just a little word of caution. Anyways, guys, that's all for me for today. Have a good one. Subscribe if you like it. Like if you like it. And, yeah, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.